Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the Protestant Reformation, going into a little bit more depth about some of the main beliefs of the Protestant Reformers than you saw in the crash course video last night. So here are the goals for the video. Make sure you can answer these questions by the time the video is over. Alright, so there are lots of different branches of Protestantism. It starts with Luther, who around 1520 breaks with the Catholic Church and starts his own, what he believes to be purified form of Christianity. With Luther questioning the authority of the Catholic Church, he kind of opens up a Pandora's box of religious interpretations. And you start to see, after this point, a whole slew of other people breaking away from the Catholic Church and practicing Christianity in their own way. A couple other major branches that catch on in large parts of Europe are Calvinism, represented on the map by the green splotches, and Anglicanism, which is more or less limited to England. There are some other minor branches too, stuff like Anabaptism, Zwinglianism, and also Quakers are other branches that also break off and decide to practice Christianity in a way that is different from Catholicism. So this map here shows you how by around the year 1600, Europe had gone from being entirely Catholic to breaking up into about half Catholic and half Protestant territories. So the first thing we need to understand is the Catholic Church on the eve of the Reformation, because the Protestant Reformation was a desire to reform Christianity from what it had become under Catholicism. So if we want to understand anything about why the Protestants are upset, we need to start by looking at the Catholic Church itself. And some of this will be a review from what we talked about during our lesson on the medieval church, but it won't hurt you to hear this all again. So there were a couple pillars of the Catholic faith that drew a lot of criticism from Protestant reformers, and we're going to go over these. First is the idea of the authority of the Pope. According to Catholicism, the Church is organized in a hierarchy of authority, and the Pope is at the top. And so the Pope is the supreme person when it comes to deciding stuff about like faith and doctrine and stuff like that. Another big idea in the Catholic Church that upsets a lot of Protestants is the idea that the Church is a mediator between man and God. That is, that human beings can only reach heaven through participation in the Catholic Church. This was summed up in the slogan, "No salvation outside of the Church." This is symbolized in Catholic paintings by the keys possessed by St. Peter. Supposedly, Jesus gave St. Peter the keys to heaven, and St. Peter became the first pope, and only through St. Peter and his successors can human beings make it to heaven. Another thing that Catholics believe is that it is necessary to perform good works in order to achieve salvation. The idea is that faith only gets you so far, and that you need to supplement faith with good works. This would be stuff like charity or pilgrimage, or also indulgences. And these would help you make it into heaven. The Catholic idea of transubstantiation attracted a lot of criticism, and this was the belief that the Holy Communion involves the literal transformation of the Eucharist and wine into the flesh and blood of Christ. And last of all, in Catholicism, a lot of Catholic doctrine was based on the Bible, but a large chunk of Catholic doctrine was not based directly on the Bible, but was based on the works of medieval theologians who used both the Bible and also logic and philosophy to reach conclusions about the nature of God. And all of these things that we mentioned are going to upset some Protestant reformers, and they're going to react against that stuff. So the first and perhaps most influential of the Protestant reformers was Martin Luther, who founded Lutheranism. So Luther was born in 1483, and he was the son, actually, of a German miner. But this miner was able to save up enough money and sent Luther to school, and Luther, after a brief stint as a law student, ended up as a monk. And Luther was an extremely faithful man, and he took Christianity and salvation so seriously that he was racked by fears that he would be sent to hell. And the main thing that he worried about was that he, as a human being, was sinful, and he was cursed, as every other human being was, through Adam and Eve's original sin. And he believed that no amount of good works could make up for the sins that he and his ancestors had committed. And this worried him greatly, because he was worried that he wouldn't be able to do enough to make up for his sins and that he would go to hell. This all changed one night when he came across the idea, as originally presented by St. Paul, that faith alone could aid man's salvation. And this was based on his personal interpretation of the Bible. And so this was the beginning and the fundamental break from Catholic doctrine. Martin Luther believed that good works were not necessary for salvation, and that they really didn't affect salvation at all. The only thing that mattered for whether a person was saved or not was whether they had faith in God and Jesus Christ and other aspects of Christian doctrine. This belief was supplemented by another belief known as Scripture alone, or in Latin, sola scriptura. And the idea with this was that all of Christianity's doctrines should be based on Scripture, not on any sort of philosophy. That the Scripture itself was the direct revelation from God, and that's where all of our beliefs about God should come from. He also believed, on this basis, that people should read the Bible themselves, not listen to a priest interpret it. And this was a big deal because it led him to translate the Bible into German, and it allowed German people to read the Bible and interpret the Bible for themselves. And a lot of German people came up with ideas that were different both from the Catholic Church and from Luther. So with this idea, he kind of opened up a can of worms that it took, took a while to put back together. And last of all is Luther's idea of the priesthood of all believers. And this idea says that all faithful Christians are equal in the eyes of God, and thus the church hierarchy does not make any sense. The Pope is not any more or less loved by God than the faithful peasant. Therefore, the Pope has no right to tell the peasant what he should do or think. Whoever has faith is equal, and therefore the church hierarchy makes no sense. So with these three things, Luther attacks some of the core pillars of the Catholic Church. He attacks the system of good works. He attacks the philosophical doctrines that the Catholic Church inherited from medieval theology. And he attacks the church hierarchy. This, of course, gets him into a lot of trouble with the church, and he risked being burned as a heretic, but he gets away with it. So now let's look at the effects of Lutheranism. So I already mentioned in the last slide how Luther's three main beliefs lead to direct conflict with some of the central Catholic beliefs. But the reason that Luther doesn't get burned at the stake, like Jan Hus and other reformers before him, was that his ideas caught on with the German princes who lived in the Holy Roman Empire. And there are several reasons for this. One is that these German princes who lived in tiny, disorganized little states all over Germany, were tired of the Catholic Church interfering in their territory. And this was one reason for them to adopt Lutheranism. Another reason was that these tiny states, which were often lacking funds, were able to increase their wealth by confiscating church lands. Both of these lead to an increase in fragmentation in the Holy Roman Empire and eventually lead to civil war between the northern Germans who have converted to Lutheranism and the southern Germans who remain loyal to the Catholic Church. In spite of this tension, Lutheranism spreads throughout much of Northern Europe, becoming especially popular in northern Germany and Scandinavia. Now let's go on to the other main branch of Protestantism known as Calvinism. And it was founded by John Calvin, who lived from 1509 to 1568. And Calvin, like Luther actually, was originally trained as a lawyer. And he grew up in France studying law. But he became interested in theology and actually ended up breaking with the Catholic Church in 1530 because he believed a lot of what the Protestant reformers like Luther were saying was correct. After his conversion, he traveled away from Catholic France into the Protestant towns of Switzerland. And there he developed his own religious ideas, and he became the religious leader of the town of Geneva. His ideas caught on and spread widely, most importantly to France, the Netherlands, and to Scotland. Calvin's ideas. The major belief in Calvinism is belief in predestination. And the logic here goes like this. Calvin believes that God, who is all-knowing, knows from the moment that a person is born whether that person will go to heaven or go to hell. The idea is that it has to be certain because God has to know, because God is all-knowing. Therefore, nothing we do in our lifetime alters our eternal fate. As soon as we're born, we're either selected by God for heaven or hell. However, Calvinists believe that those people who were going to go to heaven would live on earth like saints, and they would thereby demonstrate their salvation to others. So you couldn't affect whether you were going to go to heaven or hell, but depending on how you acted, you could prove to yourself and to your community that you were destined for one place or the other. This is linked up with one of Calvin's other main beliefs. Basically, this idea of the holy community said that the Calvinist church and Calvinist communities should only admit people who had demonstrated that they were bound for heaven. And the only way you could demonstrate that you were bound to heaven was by living every day in a saintly manner. That is, not giving into temptation or earthly pleasures, but working hard for the betterment of the community and going to church and stuff like that. Another important thing in Calvinism was the idea that Christians should not seclude themselves in monasteries like in medieval Christianity, but rather that God wanted Christians out working in the world, doing His will, and helping to build the holy community and make it stronger. What this meant is that able and active Christians, rather than going into religious pursuits, used their talents in the world to build up the community. And this had widespread economic effects as people began to devote more and more of their time to worldly economic pursuits. And finally, Calvin rejected the idea of transubstantiation. He argued that the bread and wine of communion did not literally turn into the flesh and blood of Christ, but rather that Christ was present spiritually rather than physically during the act of communion. The last big branch of Protestantism that we're going to talk about is Anglicanism. And Anglicanism is really different from both Calvinism and Lutheranism in that its main reason for coming into existence was not theological. It was not founded by a student of theology who disagreed with the Pope, but was rather founded by a king for political reasons. And so it was founded by Henry VIII, King of England, in 1533. And the reason that he founded it was basically that he wanted multiple divorces, and the Pope refused to give them. The reason that Henry VIII wanted multiple divorces is he believed that it was his wife's fault that he could not produce a male heir. And so every time one of his wives bore him a girl, he would divorce this wife, blame her for it, even though we now know, according to science, that it's the man's job to provide the Y chromosome and create a male baby. And he would get rid of that wife either by putting her in prison or exiling her, or even, in the case of Anne Boleyn, executing her. And then he would marry another woman and try to have a son with her. So the Pope, of course, did not like this, and when the Pope refused to grant Henry his second divorce, Henry decided to break with the Catholic Church and make himself the head of Christianity in England. So while he did this, he also confiscated all church property in England, which instantly made him the wealthiest person in England and the largest landholder. And this was an incredible benefit for the king. It basically gave him a lot more power and helped him to centralize his rule in England. So Anglicanism, in terms of its beliefs, is not particularly unique. They basically borrow a bunch of ideas from Luther and from Zwingli and from Calvin and mash that up with some Catholic stuff, and you get this mix of Christian flavors that is represented in the Anglican Church. So let's sum it all up. What are the effects of the Protestant Reformation? Well, there are four big ones. The first one is that for almost 100 years, from 1546 to 1648, there is non-stop religious warfare. And this comes from two things. The Protestants are trying to spread their faith out into Catholic areas, and simultaneously Catholics are trying to repress Protestantism and restore religious unity. The Catholics think that if they can win a war against the Protestants, they can force everybody back to Catholicism and bring everybody back into the fold of the one true church. But the Protestants resist furiously because they believe that they are in possession of religious truth, and that's why these two sides fight each other for so long. Another thing that happens is that a lot of Protestant governments are able to centralize because they have given themselves new religious powers. They control the church rather than the Pope, and they also have confiscated all of the wealth from the church, and they can use this wealth to expand the activity of their governments. Also, as a result of these conflicts between religious groups, you start to see the first people in Europe ever to propose ideas of religious toleration. Basically, a lot of people, most famously John Locke, see the horror of religious warfare, and they decide, hey, maybe instead of trying to force everybody to believe one thing, we should just be okay with people believing different things as long as they follow the laws of the land. And this idea starts off kind of slow, but it catches on big time and goes on actually to influence the founders of the United States. And finally, there's some big economic shifts, especially in Protestant countries. The worldly focus of Protestantism that we talked about, especially in Calvinism, encourages able men to devote themselves to economic rather than religious activity. And so you start to see a really a big upswing in trade and in industry. More time for you guys to get a sense of things. So once again, Luther's in that red area up there. The Calvinists are kind of scattered around, and the Catholics control still basically the main chunk of continental Europe. And these are the major branches there, and also minor branches that are peppered around throughout Europe. So basically, as a result of the Reformation, Europe is permanently fragmented into different religious groups, and no amount of warfare is able to unite Europe ever again under a single religious denomination. So here are the goals. I'm sorry that video lasted a little while, but hopefully you found it interesting. If not, that's okay. You don't have to love it. You just have to learn it. Good night.